Cryo's 4 maintained surface temperatures averaging degrees C, which made it profitable for rare mineral extraction and miserable for most species who staffed the mining operations. The colony functioned through extensive environmental controls, heated corridors connecting work sites, and strict protocols about exposure times for non-cold-adapted species. Taylor and Corin were Velani, from a tropical homeworld where temperatures rarely dropped below 25 degrees C, and they were walking across what sensors indicated was stable ice when the subsurface melt pocket, created by volcanic activity that recent surveys missed, caused catastrophic collapse. Both children plunged through compromised ice into water that measured -2 degrees C, kept liquid by salinity and geothermal heat, but cold enough to kill Velani biology within minutes. Taylor's last coherent thought before her consciousness started shutting down was that she and Corin were going to die before help arrived, because Velani bodies simply didn't have frameworks for surviving this kind of cold. Their species evolved on worlds where thermal regulation meant staying cool, not retaining heat, where hypothermia wasn't a concept because cold didn't exist as evolutionary pressure. 30 seconds after immersion, she could barely move. Her brother had already stopped thrashing, his smaller body succumbing even faster to water temperature that was attacking them like neurotoxin. Their distress beacon transmitted automatically. The signal reached Dr. Sarah Chen 3 kilometers away, analyzing subsurface formations for the mining company's expansion proposals. Her portable scanner displayed the beacon data. 2 Velani children, water immersion, temperature -2 degrees C, estimated survival time 4 minutes maximum given species-specific cold tolerance. Nearest emergency response team, 15 minutes out. Sarah's analysis was instantaneous and brutal. The children would be dead before proper rescue arrived. The ice was too unstable for heavy equipment. Waiting for appropriate response meant watching 2 children die while following protocols designed for scenarios where victims could survive long enough for help. She was the only responder close enough to matter. The water temperature would cause human hypothermia, would be dangerous, would push her past safe operational limits. But humans had protocols for dangerous. Velani biology had protocols for dying. Sarah shed her heavy gear, kept her emergency beacon active, and deliberately crashed through the ice into water that should have caused immediate cold shock. Taylor's fading consciousness registered impossibility. A human plunged into the water that was killing her, and instead of immediately shutting down like Velani biology was doing, the human started functioning, moving purposefully, grabbing Corin first because he was smaller and sinking faster. Sarah's mammalian dive reflex kicked in automatically, an evolutionary adaptation humans retained from their aquatic transitional ancestry. Her heart rate dropped from 70 beats per minute to 40, blood flow redirected from extremities to core organs, and her body entered a temporary state that prioritized survival in cold water over normal function. This reflex, combined with human cold water adaptations developed through tens of thousands of years colonizing Arctic environments, gave her maybe 5 minutes of functional capacity in water that was shutting down Velani biology in seconds. Sarah was cold, dangerously cold, approaching hypothermia herself. But her body had protocols for this, evolutionary responses that bought time even in lethal conditions. Velani biology had no such protocols because their evolution never encountered cold requiring survival adaptations. She dragged Corin to the surface first, her movements efficient despite the cold sapping her strength. Heaved him onto stable ice with strength that came from muscles evolved to function across Earth's psychotic temperature ranges. Then dove back for Taylor, who was barely conscious and whose body temperature had dropped to levels that meant death if rescue took much longer. The physical strain of hauling both children while fighting hypothermia was pushing Sarah past safe limits. Her core temperature was dropping, her extremities going numb, her body burning energy trying to maintain heat that the water was stealing relentlessly. But Deathworld evolution meant humans could temporarily function past the point where other species would have already died. Sarah got Taylor to the surface, pulled her onto stable ice, and activated emergency thermal protocols, heated blankets that started raising both children's body temperatures immediately, beacon calling for medical evacuation, her hands shaking as she wrapped the Vellani siblings in materials designed to save lives in conditions most species couldn't survive long enough to need saving from. Then she collapsed beside them because her own body temperature had dropped to 32 degrees C during a rescue that took 4 minutes from initial plunge to final extraction. The proper rescue team arrived 8 minutes later to find 3 beings suffering from hypothermia. 2 Vellani children who were barely alive despite immediate treatment, and 1 human who somehow survived long enough in lethal water to complete a rescue that should have been impossible. The medical team's confusion was immediate and professional. Sarah's body temperature was 32 degrees C, moderate hypothermia territory, and the water exposure should have incapacitated her before she could reach the children. "How long were you in the water?" the medical tech asked while administering warming protocols. 4 minutes, maybe 5, Sarah said through chattering teeth. Long enough to get both kids out. That water temperature would cause immediate cold shock for most species, the tech said, scanning Sarah's vitals. Your core temperature dropped to dangerous levels, but your peripheral circulation maintained enough function to complete the rescue. That's unusual. Mammalian dive reflex, Sarah explained, her speech slightly slurred from the cold. Human evolutionary adaptation. Heart rate drops, blood redirects to core organs, body prioritizes survival in cold water. Buys a few minutes before hypothermia becomes incapacitating. A few minutes, the tech repeated. You performed a double rescue in conditions that would kill most species within that time frame. The Vellani children would have died waiting for proper response, Sarah said. 4 minutes of dangerous cold seemed preferable to 15 minutes of watching them die while following protocols. Taylor and Corin were transported to medical facilities equipped for treating Vellani hypothermia, while Sarah received standard human cold exposure treatment that mostly involved warming protocols and monitoring, rather than the intensive intervention other species required. The medical staff kept describing her condition as survivable but inadvisable, which seemed to be their professional way of saying humans could tolerate conditions that would kill most species, and then just needed warming up rather than emergency life support. 3 days later, Taylor and Corin were recovering in medical when Sarah visited, moving carefully because her extremities were still healing from the cold exposure, but otherwise functional. You jumped into water that was killing us, Taylor said, trying to reconcile what happened with her understanding of biology. You should have died too. How did you survive long enough to save us? Humans evolved on a planet with extreme temperature variations, Sarah explained, sitting in the chair their parent indicated. Earth has ice ages, tropical zones, Arctic circles. We colonized every thermal extreme our planet offered because apparently surviving in one climate wasn't challenging enough. Our bodies developed adaptations for cold water, reflexes for diving, protocols for surviving hypothermia that buy critical minutes even in lethal conditions. But you experienced the same cold we did, Corin said. The same water temperature. How were you not incapacitated? I was cold, approaching dangerous hypothermia, Sarah said, but my species has biological protocols for that. The mammalian dive reflex slowed my heart rate and redirected blood flow, buying time. Cold water adaptations let me function despite dropping core temperature. And the stubborn refusal to die that characterizes Deathworld evolution kept me moving past the point where your biology would have shut down entirely. Their parent, a Vellani elder named Sether, studied Sarah with expressions suggesting they were processing uncomfortable truths about interspecies biology. You risked your life for our children when proper rescue teams were only minutes away. Why? Because they'd be dead in those minutes, Sarah said simply. And watching children die while following proper protocols seemed like a terrible plan. Humans are bad at accepting that some situations are impossible when action remains available. And our death world biology means we can sometimes survive attempting the impossible long enough to make it work. You voluntarily entered water cold enough to kill you, Sether said, and their voice carried something between gratitude and horror. Functioned in conditions that found immediately lethal for my species. Performed a rescue that required capacity your body temperature shouldn't have allowed. Then survived the experience because human biology is apparently flexible enough to temporarily become the danger that threatens everyone else. That's one way to phrase it, Sarah agreed. Earth taught us to function across thermal ranges that kill most species. The adaptations aren't comfortable. I was hypothermic. I pushed past safe limits and recovery takes time. But the alternative was letting your children die, because their biology couldn't handle conditions that my biology finds dangerous but not immediately lethal. Taylor looked at her brother, both of them processing what they'd learned about the human who saved them. Your species evolved to survive what kills ours. My species evolved on a planet that couldn't decide on a single temperature zone and kept throwing ice ages at us, Sarah corrected. We developed protocols for thermal extremes because we didn't have a choice, and sometimes those protocols are useful for rescues in conditions that proper equipment can't address fast enough. Sarah's final log entry was characteristically matter-of-fact. Responded to distress beacon from Velani siblings who fell through ice into sub-zero water. Calculated that their biology wouldn't survive time required for proper rescue response. Performed immediate extraction despite water temperature approaching human hypothermia limits. Mammalian dive reflex and cold water adaptations provided sufficient functional time to complete rescue. Both children survived with no permanent damage. Personal cold exposure resulted in moderate hypothermia requiring 3 days recovery. Recommend updating emergency protocols to account for human cold water capacity exceeding most species' tolerance. Were apparently useful for rescues in conditions that our own biology finds dangerous but not immediately lethal. The mining colony's emergency response protocols were updated to include humans in cold water rescue teams, specifically because their death world adaptations made them capable of operations in conditions that proper equipment couldn't address within survival timeframes for most species. Taylor and Corin recovered fully, their hypothermia treated before permanent damage occurred. They returned to their parents' quarters with new understanding of the human who'd saved them. Deathworlders didn't just endure conditions that killed others. They'd evolved to temporarily become the dangers that threatened everyone else, to function in the lethal and then recover from it, to treat thermal extremes as challenges rather than absolute limits. Sarah continued her geological surveys on Cryos 4, now occasionally interrupted by requests to consult on emergency response protocols for cold environment operations, because apparently surviving what kills most species made her useful for planning how to rescue others from similar conditions. The transformation was complete when other species started recognizing that humans' death-world biology wasn't just about enduring harsh conditions. It was about being able to operate in environments that their own evolution made lethal, buying critical minutes through adaptations that proper technology couldn't replicate, and surviving attempts at the impossible long enough to sometimes make them work. 2 Velani siblings trapped beneath ice, perishing in water their biology couldn't handle. 1 human geological surveyor who calculated impossible odds and jumped in anyway. 4 minutes of functioning in conditions that should have killed her. 2 children saved because deathworld evolution taught humans to temporarily become the cold that threatened everyone else, and then recover from it. Sometimes the best rescue tool was a species crazy enough to have evolved protocols for surviving what kills everyone else, and stubborn enough to try anyway.